Imagine a fierce summer wind howling across the red rocks of Four Corners in 1884. A 10-year-old girl in a dusty black and white dress, her father's old brown vest torn at the sleeve, and his weathered Stetson hat tied tight under her chin, gallops alone on a gray horse named Dusty. Lila Harper has lost everything except courage. One desperate cry in the storm changes her life forever, turning a lonely orphan into the bravest protector a Lakota boy has ever known. What begins as a daring rescue amid swirling dust and gunfire ends with a sacred promise that rewrites her destiny and melts even the hardest hearts. Will a little cowgirl's bravery bridge two worlds and build a family no storm can break? Stay until the very end. You won't believe how beautiful it gets. If this tugs at your heart already, hit that subscribe button, give it a thumbs up, and comment where you're watching from. Tell me your city or country. It truly motivates me to bring more stories like this. Now, let's ride into the dust together. The summer of 1884 baked the Four Corners until the ground cracked like old leather and the sky turned the color of dried blood. Heat shimmered off the red sandstone mesas, and every breath tasted of iron and dust. Lila Harper, 10 years old and small enough to slip through a fence rail, rode alone on Dusty, a raw-boned gray with a white blaze and one blue eye that never missed trouble. Her black and white calico dress was sun-bleached to the color of bone. Her father's brown vest hung loose on her narrow shoulders, and the old Stetson, too big when he died, now just right, was lashed under her chin with a rawhide string he'd braided himself the week before the raiders came. She had been tracking stray horses since dawn, following broken sage and scattered prints toward the dry wash the old-timers called Devil's Throat. The wind came in hot gusts, lifting grit that stung like birdshot. Dusty's ears flicked forward, then pinned flat. He stopped dead, muscles trembling under the saddle. Lila heard it the same instant he did. A thin, high cry carried on the wind, half swallowed by the growing roar. She stood in the stirrups, shading her eyes. Far below, in the red gut of the wash, a wall of dust rose like a living thing, towering, rolling, hungry. Haboob, the kind that buried wagons and stripped flesh from bone. Then she saw the boy. He couldn't have been more than 8, barefoot, buckskin shirt flapping as he ran along the cracked bottom of the wash. Behind him, 2 riders, big men in sweat-stained canvas coats, spurred their mounts down the bank, ropes already uncoiling. Bounty hunters, scalp men, the kind that sold Lakota children by the head to the highest bidder back east, or worse, to the mines. The boy stumbled. The first coil of rope hissed through the air and missed. The second rider laughed, a sound like breaking sticks. Lila's heart slammed against her ribs. She had no rifle, only her father's old Navy Colt, too heavy for her hip and empty anyway. She had no plan. She had Dusty, the best cutting horse ever foaled on the San Juan, and a rage hotter than the noon sun. She leaned low over the gray's neck, felt the bunch and surge of muscle beneath her. "Run, boy," she whispered into Dusty's ear. "Run like the devil himself is behind us." Dusty launched forward, hooves drumming thunder across the baked clay. The wind hit them sideways, trying to shove them off the rim. Lila crouched lower, knees clamped tight, braid whipping like a battle standard. The edge of the wash dropped sharp as a knife blade. She didn't slow. Dusty gathered himself and jumped, front legs tucked, hind legs driving, sailing out over empty air and landing hard on the sloping bank below in a spray of red dirt. The hunter saw her coming. One reached for his pistol. The other shouted something lost in the wind. Lila didn't waste breath on words. She aimed Dusty straight at the boy, who had fallen to his knees, arms wrapped around his head, as the dust wall roared closer. 50 yards. 30. The first hunter swung his horse to block her path, rope raised like a whip. Lila yanked the reins hard left. Dusty spun on his hocks, sliding in the sand, and shot past so close she smelled the man's sour sweat. The rope cut empty air above her hat. She was on the boy now. He looked up, dark eyes wide, face streaked with tears and dust. Lakota. She knew the cut of his hair, the beadwork on what was left of his shirt. "Grab on!" she yelled. English and Spanish tangled together the way the border kids talked. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the outstretched hand. He lunged. Small fingers locked around her wrist like iron. Lila hauled with everything she had, swinging him up behind the saddle as Dusty never broke stride. The boy's legs scrabbled for purchase. She felt his chest heaving against her back. Behind them, guns cleared leather. The first bullet whined past her ear and buried itself in the canyon wall. The second punched through the sleeve of her father's vest, hot iron kissing skin. She felt the burn but didn't look. Couldn't look. The dust wall was almost on them. A roaring red mountain ready to swallow the world. Lila kicked Dusty hard. The gray lunged forward, ears flat, mane whipping her face like wire. Ahead, the narrow slot between two towering sandstone fins, barely wider than a horse and rider, offered the only chance. She aimed for it, praying the hunter's mounts were too big to follow. Behind her, the boy clung tight, small heart hammering against her spine. The storm hit like the fist of God. The wall of dust slammed into them like a runaway freight train, turning day to night in one heartbeat. Sand blasted sideways, hard enough to scour paint off wagon sides. Lila couldn't see her own hands on the reins. She couldn't see Dusty's ears. All she had was the feel of the gray's neck under her cheek, the frantic clutch of small arms around her waist, and the thunder of two heavier horses somewhere behind. She let the reins go slack. Dusty didn't need telling twice. He dropped his head and bored straight into the slot canyon she'd prayed was there. Rock walls rose on both sides, so close she felt the scrape of stone on her stirrup irons. The Stetson brim scraped sparks off the sandstone. She ducked lower, pressing the Lakota boy flat against her back. A rifle boomed behind them. The report flattened and swallowed by the storm. The bullet ricocheted somewhere overhead in a shower of rock splinters that stung like hornets. The slot twisted left, then right, narrower with every stride. Lila tasted blood where she'd bitten her tongue. Dusty's hooves slipped on loose gravel. For one sick instant, they slid sideways, shoulder grinding the wall. But the gray dug in and lunged forward again. Somewhere back there, a horse screamed, too big, too wide, followed by the crash of a body hitting stone and a string of curses that died under the wind. Then the canyon spat them out onto a bench of open, slick rock. The storm still raged, but the worst of the funnel had passed overhead. Visibility climbed from 2 feet to 20. Lila hauled Dusty up hard, spinning him to face the way they'd come. Nothing but swirling red haze and the faint echo of a second horse limping away. She didn't wait to see if they'd try again. She booted Dusty into a reaching lope across the slick rock, following the old Ute trail her father had shown her years ago when she was barely big enough to sit a saddle alone. The boy behind her was shaking so hard his teeth rattled against her spine. "Hold tight," she shouted over the wind. "We ain't clear yet." Lightning cracked across the sky, white and vicious, lighting the mesas blood red for one frozen second. Thunder followed like artillery. The storm was chasing them now, a second haboob building behind the first. If it caught them in the open, they were finished. Lila cut north, angling for the broken country where the canyons braided like rope. She knew every twist from riding them with her paw, hunting strays, running from boredom and grief. She rode by feel more than sight, The drop of the land under Dusty's hooves, the smell of wet creosote when the first fat raindrops finally punched through the dust. Behind them, a third rider appeared out of the murk. One of the original hunters must have circled wide. He came on hard, hat gone, face wrapped in a bandana, rifle across his saddlebow. Lila saw the glint of the barrel rising. She yanked Dusty sharp right, down a pour-off no sane horseman would take. The gray sat back on his haunches and slid, hooves locked, showering gravel into the void. They hit the bottom, still running. The hunter tried to follow, and his horse refused, rearing and dumping him hard. Lila didn't look back. Rain came then, sudden and violent, turning dust to mud that sucked at hooves and plastered hair to faces. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a minute. The boy's grip loosened. He was sliding, half frozen. Lila wheeled Dusty into the lee of an overhang, slid from the saddle, and dragged the boy down with her. He crumpled against the rock, coughing blood-tinged dust. His left forearm was rope-burned raw, where the first lasso had kissed him. She ripped the bandana from her own neck, her father's old red one, and tied it tight above the worst of the burn. Then she pulled the boy against her chest, wrapping the too big vest around both of them. Dusty stood over them like a sentinel, sides heaving, head low. The storm screamed overhead. Somewhere out there, the hunters were still hunting. But right now, the desert itself was trying to kill them, and Lila Harper figured one fight at a time was plenty. She rested her cheek against the crown of the Lakota boy's dust-caked hair and whispered the only thing that mattered. I got you. I got you now. The rain hammered the overhang like buckshot on tin, then eased to a steady drum. Lila counted heartbeats until the thunder rolled farther east. She eased the boy upright. His eyes were glassy, his lips cracked and white. Name's Lila, she said, voice rough from dust. You? He swallowed hard. Wiakpa. She nodded once, filed it away. No time for more. The storm had bought them hours, maybe a day, but the hunters would circle like buzzards. She scanned the lee side of the overhang and spotted the dark mouth her pa had marked with a chisel years back, an ancient ute shelter half hidden by a slump of boulder. Up you go. She boosted Wiakpa onto Dusty's saddle, then led the gray by the bridle into the narrow cleft. Inside, the air turned cool and damp, smelling of bat guano and centuries of smoke. Petroglyphs stared down. Spiral suns, stick figure hunters chasing bighorn, handprints the size of a child's. Lila ran her fingers over one, her father's secret sign, a tiny cross scratched beside the door. Safe. She tethered Dusty to a cedar root, unsaddled him, and rubbed him down with a fistful of sage. The horse drank from a seep in the rock, then folded his legs and sighed. Wiakpa slid to the floor, knees buckling. Lila caught him before he hit the stone. 3 days' worth of hardtack and jerky rode in her saddlebags, meant for one growing girl, now split between 2 half-starved kids and a horse. She broke a strip of jerky, softened it in water from her canteen, and pressed it to the boy's lips. He chewed slowly, eyes never leaving her face. Night fell hard. The storm returned in waves, wind screaming through the cleft like a locomotive. Lila built a small fire with dead juniper she'd gathered at dusk, cupping the flames so the smoke rose thin and straight. Shadows danced across the petroglyphs, making the ancient hunters seem to move. Wiakpa shivered in his thin buckskin. Lila peeled off her father's vest, still warm from her body, and draped it over his shoulders. The bullet tear gaped like an accusation. She tore a strip from her petticoat, bound her own arm where the graze had crusted over. Pain was just another rider to outrun. Sleep, she told him. I'll keep watch. He shook his head. They'll come. Not tonight. Desert's doing our fighting for us. She fed the fire sparingly. Outside, lightning stitched the sky, revealing distant mesas like the ribs of some dead giant. Between claps of thunder, she heard coyotes, then nothing. The boy finally dozed, head on her thigh, one small fist curled around the fringe of the vest. Lila stayed awake, carving slivers of pine with her pocket knife, listening. On the second daw, the rain stopped as suddenly as it started. Water dripped from the overhang in silver ropes. She stepped out, boots squelching in mud, and studied the horizon. Fresh hoofprints cut the slick rock. 3 riders, maybe 4, heading north. They were flanking wide, betting she'd make for the trading post at Bluff. Wrong bet. She returned inside, woke Wiakpa with a gentle shake. "We're moving at dusk. Hunters think we'll run for water. We'll hole up instead." He rubbed sleep from his eyes. "Where?" She tapped the rock wall. "Deeper." Pa showed me a back chamber. Spring, smoke hole, room for Dusty. Ute used it when the Navajo raided. We'll be ghosts. They spent the day preparing. Lila showed Wiakpa how to twist yucca fiber into cord, how to chew pine pitch to seal cracks in the canteen. He taught her Lakota words for wind and stone. By afternoon, the fire was banked to coals, the saddlebags repacked light. She sharpened a mesquite stick into a spear, just in case. As the sun bled out behind the mesas, Lila paused at the cleft mouth. The desert lay quiet, steam rising from red earth. Somewhere out there, men with dollars on their minds were closing the net. She thought of her father's grave, 2 years unmarked under a cedar on the home ranch, and felt the old burn in her chest. Hey, if this tale of 2 kids and 1 tough horse outsmarting the desert is pulling you in, do me a solid. Smash that subscribe button and drop a comment with your hometown. Knowing folks from Texas to Tokyo are riding along keeps the stories coming. Now, let's slip deeper into the rock before the hunters sniff our trail. They led Dusty single file into the narrow passage, the gray's hooves echoing like slow heartbeats. The cleft pinched tight, then opened into a vaulted chamber lit by a shaft of dying light. A trickle of water sang over stone into a natural basin. Lila exhaled, first real breath in days. Wiakpa touched the wall, tracing a faded pictograph of a horse with wings. "My grandfather says the old ones painted dreams here." Lila unsaddled Dusty, let him drink. "Tonight we dream of staying alive." She banked the fire against the far wall, hung her father's vest to dry. The boy curled beside the flames, exhaustion finally winning. Lila sat with her back to the rock, knife across her knees, listening to the desert settle into night. 3 days, she figured. 3 days to let the hunters ride past, to let the land forget their tracks. Then they'd make for the Lakota camp at dawn on the 4th. Until then, this stone womb was home. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint, acrid scent of tobacco smoke. Someone camping close. Lila's grip tightened on the knife. The game wasn't over. The tobacco smoke hung in the air like a warning flag. Lila eased forward on her belly, knife in hand, until she could peer through a crack in the outer cleft. 2 fires glowed a quarter-mile out. 5 men now, their horses picketed in a loose circle. One was cleaning a rifle by firelight. Another unfolded a crumpled wanted poster and tapped it with a greasy finger. Even at this distance, she caught the word Chaska and the glint of reward money changing hands. They knew exactly whose son they'd lost. She slid back inside, mind racing. Dawn on the 4th day was hours away, and the Lakota camp lay 20 miles north across open grassland. They'd be spotted the moment they broke cover. She needed the hunters to look somewhere else. Wiakpa was already awake, eyes sharp in the low firelight. Lila motioned him close and whispered her plan. He listened without blinking, then nodded once. grim but ready. They worked fast and quietly. Lila loosened a fist-sized chunk of sandstone from the chamber wall and tied it to a long yucca cord. Wiakpa gathered dry brush and stuffed it into cracks near the entrance. She rubbed Dusty's legs with sage to mask his scent, then looped a spare lead rope across the narrow passage at knee height for a horse. Simple, brutal, and borrowed straight from her father's stories of Apache ambushes. When the moon dropped behind the mesa, they moved. Lila led Dusty out the back fissure, a squeeze so tight the saddle scraped sparks, and tied him in a shallow draw. She sent Wiakpa uphill with a burning twig wrapped in wet grass. The boy would light a patch of dry cheatgrass on the far ridge, then double back. She stayed low, crawling to the hunter's picket line on her belly like a sidewinder. The horses smelled her before the men did. One nickered. Lila froze. A guard glanced up, then settled back into his coffee. She cut 3 cinches halfway through with her knife, just enough to hold a rider's weight for a few strides, not a chase. Then she scattered a handful of caltrops, fashioned from mesquite thorns, across the only clear exit from their camp. She was 20 yards away when the first flame bloomed on the distant ridge. Orange light licked the sky. The hunters jumped up, cursing. "Fire! That's our signal! Kids on the move!" Saddles slapped leather. Cinches held just long enough for 5 riders to swing up and kick hard toward the blaze. The first horse hit the hidden rope at a gallop. Its front legs folded, and it went down hard, pitching its rider into the fire pit. Sparks exploded. A second horse stepped on the thorns, rearing and screaming. 2 more cinches snapped like gunfire. One man hit the ground face first. Another clung to a saddle that slid under his horse's belly. Chaos swallowed the camp. Rifles cracked at shadows. Horses bolted in every direction. Lila was already running. She met Wiakpa halfway down the draw, grabbed his hand, and swung him up behind Dusty's saddle. The gray needed no urging. He burst from the draw at a dead run, hooves pounding across the flats like war drums. Behind them, shouts faded under the wind. They rode north under starlight, keeping to low ground where the grass swallowed prints. Lila pushed Dusty hard, but not cruel. Steady lope, mile after mile. The boy clung to her waist, silent, trusting. When the first gray of false dawn touched the horizon, she eased into a walk and let the horse blow. Sweat steamed off his hide in the cool air. A mile later, she spotted a fresh sign. 5 shod horses cutting east, away from the fire trick. The hunters had bitten hard and were chasing ghosts. Good. The real dawn broke red and clean. Lila crested a low rise, and there it was, the grassland opening wide, dotted with teepees like white cones against the green. Smoke curled from morning fires. Ponies grazed under watchful boys. The Lakota camp. She reined in. Wiakpa straightened behind her, breath catching. Almost there. But the hunters weren't done. A distant dust plume rose in the east. 3 riders cutting across at an angle, trying to intercept before the camp sentries saw them. They'd guessed the fire was a ruse and doubled back. Smart. And fast. Lila's jaw set. She glanced at the camp, half a mile, maybe less. Sentries were already mounting, spotting the lone gray horse on the rise. But the hunters would reach the open ground first. She leaned low over Dusty's neck. "One more run, old friend." The gray gathered himself and shot forward like a bullet from a Winchester. Grass whipped their legs. The wind roared in their ears. Behind, the hunters saw them and spurred harder, closing the gap. A rifle cracked. The bullet kicked dirt 20 yards short. Lila angled left, forcing the pursuers to spread. The camp erupted. War cries, ponies wheeling, warriors streaming out with lances and rifles. The hunters saw the tide turning and hauled up short, cursing, then wheeled and fled east, scattering like quail. Dusty thundered the last 100 yards and slid to a stop in a cloud of dust. Warriors circled, bows drawn, until Weeyakpa slid down and shouted in Lakota. Weapons lowered. A woman's cry cut the air, raw, joyous. The camp surged forward. Lila stayed in the saddle, chest heaving, blood crusting her arm, father's vest hanging torn and filthy. She watched a tall warrior with eagle feathers in his braid push through the crowd, eyes locked on the boy. They were home. Chaska, tall as a lodgepole pine and twice as straight, strode through the parting warriors until he stood 10 feet from Dusty. The morning sun caught the silver in his braids and the eagle feathers that hung motionless in the sudden hush. His eyes, black, unreadable, moved from his son's dust-caked face to the small girl still astride the gray, one hand on the reins, the other resting on the butt of an empty Colt that had never left her hip. Weeyakpa slid down and ran. He slammed into his father's legs, arms wrapping tight around buckskin-clad thighs. Chaska dropped to one knee, enfolding the boy in a single, fierce motion. No words, just the sound of a man breathing his child back into the world. Then the chief rose. The camp held its breath. He walked forward until Dusty's nose nearly touched his chest. The gray stood steady, ears forward, sweat carving pale rivers through the red dust on his neck. Chaska placed one calloused palm on the horse's forehead, then looked up at Lila. His gaze took in the torn vest, the blood-crusted sleeve, the Stetson tied under her chin with rawhide gone dark from sweat and storm. He spoke in Lakota, low and deliberate. An elder translated, voice rough as gravel. Why does a white child risk skin and bone for a Lakota son? Lila met his stare without flinching. Her voice came out hoarse, scraped raw by 4 days of dust and fire. Because 2 years ago nobody rode fast enough for my pa. Raiders put him in the ground and took everything but this horse and this hat. She touched the brim. I wasn't big enough then. I am now. A ripple went through the warriors. Surprise, recognition, something close to respect. Chaska studied her longer. The wind lifted a loose strand of her braid and whipped it across her cheek like a war banner. Finally, he spoke again, and the elder's translation carried across the silent circle. In the old way, when a stranger gives life to the child of a leader, the spirits do not call them a stranger anymore. The one who saves becomes Winyan Wawaching, woman of courage, guardian by blood right of the spirit, not by birth. The debt is not repaid. It is carried forward, generation to generation. He stepped closer, placed his right hand flat over Lila's heart. The touch was light, but it pinned her like iron. You rode through fire and lit for my son. From this son to the last son, you are of this fire, this lodge, this people. No council can deny it. No white law can break it. Nasha, Weeyakpa's mother, pushed through the crowd. Her face was streaked with the tears she had not allowed herself to shed while her child was gone. She reached up, took Lila's dust-black hand, and pressed it to her own cheek. Then she did something no outsider had ever seen. She unclasped the heavy turquoise and silver necklace from her own throat, 3 generations old, worn only by the women who carried the chief's line, and fastened it around Lila's neck. The weight of it settled against the torn vest like a brand. Weeyakpa tugged free of his father and ran back. From his small belt pouch, he drew a carved bone circle, polished smooth by generations of Lakota thumbs. A single eagle feather hung from it. He reached up and tied it into Lila's braid, right beside the rawhide string that held her father's hat. For always, he said in careful English. So the wind knows you are ours. Lila felt the camp close around her like warm hide walls. Old women began the low, rising song of return. Young warriors raised lances to the sky. Children darted forward, touching Dusty's legs in wonder at the horse who had outrun death itself. Chaska lifted Wiakpa to his shoulder, then extended his other hand to Lila. She took it. He pulled her down from the saddle as easily as lifting a hawk from the air. Her boots hit the ground, and her knees buckled. 4 days of no sleep and little food finally cashing their bill. Strong arms caught her before she fell. The last thing she saw before exhaustion shut her eyes was the circle of Lakota faces, the red sunrise behind them, and the knowledge that she had crossed a line no map could draw. She woke hours later inside a teepee that smelled of sweet grass and cedar smoke. Nasha sat beside her, grinding dried meat into pemmican. Wiakpa slept, curled against her side like a pup. Dusty stood outside the door, unsaddled and blanketed, a Lakota boy already braiding red ribbons into his mane. Lila touched the turquoise at her throat, felt the bones circle in her hair. She was 10 years old, an orphan of the San Juan Range, and she had come home. The dust has settled over Four Corners, but that little cowgirl's ride still echoes across the red rock canyons. A 10-year-old girl, one gray horse, and a heart bigger than the desert itself proved that family isn't always born. It's chosen in fire and sealed in courage. Drop a comment and tell me, what hit you hardest? Lila's grit, Dusty's heart, or the moment the Lakota circle closed around an orphan? Your thoughts keep these trails alive. Thanks for riding every dusty mile with me. See you at the next campfire. Bring your coffee strong and your stories stronger. Until then, keep the wind at your back.